Welcome to the video. Today we're going to be talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender and also The Legend of Korra and how to translate it from the animated series into a film. So as many of you guys know, Avatar and The Legend of Korra are my favourite shows of all time, that including any live action shows and any animated shows, so they are beloved to me. But as all of you guys probably know if you're watching this video, the 2010 M. Night Shyamalan film that came out was very disappointing, and yes, I did like some parts of it, but it overall was kind of a mess and it didn't really flow like an Avatar film should. So we're going to be discussing how to make a Avatar film and what actually has to be included in the components that say the Avatar 2010 film actually didn't have, but they had some parts of it but barely. So I've got a list here. We're going to be going through the things, and please be sure to leave a like and a comment and subscribe. So here we go. So Avatar and The Legend of Korra, we're going to be talking about both of these. How will we translate these into films? So my main thing is, don't make just one film. It has to be a continuation, a trilogy, like the 2010 film was actually setting up, so they did that part right, but it just wouldn't work cramming all the story from all 3 seasons of Avatar: The Last Airbender or all 4 seasons of The Legend of Korra. So you would have to do a continuation. That is a must do, because if you try and cram it into a 2-hour film or so, it just wouldn't work. None of the storylines would be that compelling, because you would only get a fraction of what makes the series so good on both counts, that being The Legend of Korra and Avatar: The Last Airbender. So moving on to the components of the film and what needs to happen if they do this. The opening, it must be as compelling as the opening episodes of The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra. Not just a text crawl like they had in the 2010 film, but a sequence of shots like the animated intros. Although they recreated it, they need to do something better than that and visually show us the prior events, rather than doing a text scroll like Star Wars, which doesn't work in all instances like the 2010 film, because you don't get a feel for what's happening. And if they did this with a visual montage, it would actually create a link and it would visually link us to the past, and then we can move on to the present past there, and it's basically show don't tell. They show us the events that happened, and that's something that the 2010 The Last Airbender film actually did wrong. So the soundtrack has to be made by the same people or coordinated alongside them, because the whole thing of Avatar and Korra, it's the soundtrack, it's the music behind it, is part of what makes it so brilliant. Because of the various different styles actually incorporated, the main themes were barely used in the 2010 film, and that is something that is a must need in a Korra or Avatar Last Airbender film if it was to ever happen again in the future. So the cast, I would say if they were to go with a Last Airbender remake, they should make the cast a bit older in live action, because these characters in the shows are so memorable. It would have to be someone who looks relatively similar to the cartoon, yet it doesn't really matter how far away they are, but their performances is a must need. They have to be full of passion, they must know everything about the series, and it must make them feel like they're in that world, and the characters must have layers, and that is something that the 2010 film really didn't have. You didn't feel for any of the characters. Sokka didn't have his charm, Katara was shallow, and Aang just wasn't Aang. If they were to do a remake and start again with the Last Airbender films, I would recommend that they cast older actors, considering their performance must be really good and it must be really sincere, and I don't think young actors like a 12-year-old to play Aang would be the most suitable thing. So I think from a fan's perspective, if they want a really good film like myself, I think it's totally fine if they cast someone a bit older, who looks a bit older. And if they are to do airbenders, they must do the blue arrow on their head, not just an outline like the 2010 film. But if they were to do Legend of Korra live, I think that's at a much better place. They can cast people around the same age, in the 20s, for Mako, Bolin and Korra and Asami and everyone like that, all the main cast. And like Tenzin, they could literally use J.K. Simmons for Tenzin. That will be perfect. He's the perfect age for Tenzin. He looks like his character. So I don't think Korra would have such a big problem with the cast. So another component of the cast that must happen is the cast must bounce off of each other, connecting in fight scenes and dialogue scenes, and be true to those characters, which the 2010 M. Night Shyamalan film actually wasn't. So the live action film made the characters boring and you really couldn't connect with them, and the main cast must actually train in those fight styles. Even if they're not masters at it, you must be able to do some of it, and you must be able to look compelling enough for the spectator to actually feel like you've lived in that world, you've done that, you're actually a waterbender or whatever bender you are, and you are actually there. And one massive complaint I had with the 2010 Avatar film was that none of them could say the names right. They said Ong instead of Aang, and they said the Avatar instead of the Avatar. That just really annoyed me, so they've got to work on how they actually say stuff. Maybe it was on purpose, but it really kind of put me off because it felt like I'm used to Katara and Sokka saying Aang. Yeah, that's mainly to do with the Avatar The Last Airbender film, if they're actually going to make that again, which I do really hope they do, and especially I really want a Legend of Korra trilogy film. Any of those films done in the right way would be brilliant. So expressionism is key in The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra, so don't try and make these fight sequences seem super realistic. Go crazy with it. The choreography must be using the real techniques. Get professionals at those martial arts as the extras, not just random actors. So the firebenders must be trained in Northern Shaolin, waterbenders must be trained in Tai Chi, earthbenders must be trained in Hungar, and airbenders must be trained in Bagua Zhang, and I think I'm totally butchering that, but I'm sorry about that. So the bending styles must have their own identity, and I would even say that they have character on the TV shows, so they must do that. And I would be super interested to see if they actually went along with this and they made the styles actually flow better rather than the 2010 film where it felt like they were doing the actions but the bending actually wasn't going with them. It felt like a totally separate thing. So moving on from that, so expressionism is key. They must not try and make it seem ultra realistic. It must be that the bending is actually flowing from what the movements are, which the 2010 film really failed at in my opinion. And so moving on, in book one of each film, that being Korra and The Last Airbender, you must pick out the most important stories and give remnants of the other episodes that aren't fully touched upon in those films. In The Legend of Korra, going over some of the episodes with the pro bending matches, they should show a few of those, but they should scan over quite a few of those and put heavy focus upon Korra's training and her relations with Mako and Bolin, Asami and Tenzin, for example. But also Amon must be really intimidating. That is key if they're going to do a Legend of Korra film. But same goes for The Last Airbender. It must be that they pick out the most important stories. I think they did a good choice in the 2010 film, pulling out the stories, but if they were to do it again, they could change some of them, bring in some more important elements like the Kyoshi warriors, which they really just went totally over upon, and they didn't even make it to the final cut. They were just in the deleted scenes, so they need to include those if they were to ever do a Last Airbender remake. So the writing, don't hold back on the ethical or moral dilemmas. The dialogue is something that in the series, in Legend of Korra and The Last Airbender, they are key, because if you don't have the political talk and everything to do with that, which the show is really about, the sexism in the Northern Water Tribe, everything to do with that, it wouldn't be the same. It just wouldn't work. So I felt like they had a lack of that in the writing in the 2010 Last Airbender film. The dark and light tones, so moving on to tones, I think it should be a 12A rating, 12 rating, somewhere around there, and I think they could even stretch it for the third film in a trilogy to actually make it a 15 rating, with the final fight with Sozin against Aang. And then in Legend of Korra, I don't think it necessarily needs to be a 15, I think it would be better at a 12A, so most of these films would be good around the 12A section in my opinion. So they must touch upon the dark and light tones, the humour must be there, which I felt like the 2010 film of Avatar The Last Airbender really lacked. It didn't have Sokka's personality, he was really blunt, he was boring, and the intensity of the fights must be there. It must feel like the bending is actually there rather than the 2010 Last Airbender film. It felt like it was just totally put in after, and it didn't flow. When they moved, the water moved like 10 seconds afterwards, and things like that really didn't work in that 2010 film. So they're gonna have to try and find out how the bending styles will actually flow properly like they do in the animated shows. So the intimidation, don't show Fire Lord Ozai in full light and only show him in shadow in the first film. We don't really see him in his present day form until later episodes, so I think giving him away too early, or giving Azula away too early, people like that, giving Amon's identity away, they must delay that, they must do that and try to not rush this and do the show don't tell thing. Show them the shadow, but don't tell them who they are straight away. So the camera and cinematography is key. You must feel like you're there via the movement of the camera. Think of something like Matthew Vaughn's work with Kingsman, or think of something like Tarantino's work and how he actually flows with his camera, and you feel like you're really there. So there must be fast-paced action with moments like that, and lots of slow-mo moments with the great fight scenes, maybe in the Agni Kais and things like that, especially in that last fight scene in book 3 of Avatar The Last Airbender between Azula and Zuko. So same thing goes for The Legend of Korra with the Amon fight. When Korra finally realizes that she can airbend, that moment in the TV show with the slow motion is key. You must do that, and I feel like it would actually be brilliant if the cinematography was really nice, really crisp, with great visuals and an extraordinary use of color, which is key because the architecture from the Fire Nation, the Water Tribes, the Air Temples and the Earth Kingdom is actually so key, because in the 2010 film they really didn't touch upon too much of that. The ships were pretty cool, but the architecture just wasn't as great as it was in the TV shows, and they must do that. But moving back to the camera and the cinematography, the director, who I'm not sure who it should be, but it should be someone who is familiar with Matthew Vaughn or with Edgar Wright or with Quentin Tarantino, which it could be any of those. But the fast-paced action, there must be scenes where, say, Aang is airbending, where you feel like you're there, you feel like it's actually flowing, and it's not just all external shots. Like some POV shots would be really cool, and just the way that they actually show the airbending and the other types of bending is key. They must do it differently from what they did in that film, because it really didn't flow well, like I've mentioned earlier. And final point, lots of CGI, but it must be done in such an animatic way that you feel like you're actually controlling the water, the air, the fire or the earth, like you're actually doing it correctly, and that it's not just placed in after with CGI. And the CGI must be much better than the 2010 film, considering the airbending was especially bad in that you didn't even see it barely. It was just like a gush of wind, and I feel like they should definitely go for the expressionist version of that and totally emphasize them actually using the airbending, the water bending, the fire bending, the earth bending. I feel like they must do that. They must emphasize upon that it is a spectacular thing in the Avatar world. But anyway guys, thank you guys so much for watching this Avatar video. But I really do hope that The Legend of Korra gets its own film trilogy with the 4 seasons, with season 1, with season 2, with season 3, my favorite season, with season 4. And I really do hope that The Last Airbender gets a justified film that is actually really good. And I think with all these components that we've talked about in this video, how could you go so wrong? So anyway guys, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.